In recent years, a growing belief has emerged that African Americans might have been present in America long before the transatlantic slave trade. This intriguing idea, rooted in family stories and interpretations of history, raises important questions. Could it be possible that some African Americans were already here, contributing to the rich tapestry of early American history? To explore this, we must first understand the origins of this belief. Many African Americans have passed down oral traditions suggesting a different narrative of their origins. These stories speak to a deep connection to the land and history that predates the commonly accepted timeline. As we dive deeper, we encounter one of the most debated points: the absence of preserved slave ships. Some argue that this undermines the historical narrative of the transatlantic slave trade. While it's true that many original ships no longer exist, this absence does not negate the extensive documentation, records, and archaeological findings that overwhelmingly confirm the reality of the transatlantic slave trade. But let's put this into perspective. There are also very few, if any, fully preserved Civil War ships left today. Does that mean the Civil War never happened? Of course not. Does that mean that hundreds of battles wasn't fought at sea? Absolutely not. Just like the transatlantic slave trade, the absence of preserved warships does not erase the mountains of historical records, eyewitness accounts, and material evidence that confirm these events happened. Many historical artifacts, whether slave ships or warships, have been lost to time, sunken beneath the ocean, dismantled, or destroyed. This is why history cannot rely solely on physical remains. It must also consider written accounts, records, and oral traditions that have been passed down for generations. Throughout this video, we'll peel back these layers of history, examining the evidence and perspectives that have shaped our understanding. As we do, we'll uncover the rich and complex truth of our origins, revealing how these narratives continue to shape our collective identity. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was one of the most defining conflicts in U.S. history. While many debates exist about its cause, the central issue was slavery, more specifically, whether the Southern states had the right to continue enslaving black people, or if the U.S. government would finally abolish the institution nationwide. By the early 1860s, tensions had reached a breaking point. The Southern states, known as the Confederacy, wanted to break away from the United States because they feared that the newly elected president, Abraham Lincoln, would eventually outlaw slavery. In 1861, the war officially began when the Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Union, Northern states, led by Lincoln, fought to preserve the United States and eventually to end slavery. Did Native Americans fight in the Civil War? Yes, many members of the Five Civilized Tribes fought in the war, mostly on the side of the Confederacy, because they practiced slavery themselves. The Confederacy promised them land and sovereignty, and they wanted to maintain their way of life and economic interests. However, not all Native Americans supported the Confederacy. Some fought for the Union, and others tried to stay out of the war altogether. The turning point. Who won? For the first few years, the Confederacy was winning, largely due to the military leadership and the knowledge of the Southern terrain. However, as the war dragged on, the Union gained momentum. The major turning points were: the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, declaring enslaved people in the Confederate States free, though it wasn't enforced until later. Also in 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg, where the Union defeated the Confederacy in a major loss for the South. 1864, General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, where the Union destroyed major southern cities and supply lines. By April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, officially marking the end of the war. The end of the war. What happened next? The Confederacy was defeated, and slavery was officially abolished in the United States through the 13th Amendment in December 1865. However, this was just the beginning of major conflicts over what freedom actually meant for African Americans, especially those who had been enslaved by Native American tribes. What happened after the Civil War? The Five Tribes and the 1866 Treaties. The Civil War was over. The Confederacy had been defeated, and the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery in December of 1865. But for many African Americans, especially those who had been enslaved by Native American tribes, freedom did not come easily. During the war, the Five Civilized Tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had supported the Confederacy. Many of them enslaved African Americans and fought against the Union to protect their way of life, including slavery. Since these tribes had aligned with the Confederacy, they were first to sign new treaties with the U.S. government in 1866. These treaties came with major consequences. The 1866 Treaties and Freedmen citizenship. The U.S. government punished the Five Civilized Tribes for siding with the Confederacy. In 1866, each of these tribes were required to sign a treaty that 1. Abolished slavery within the nations. 2. Granted tribal citizenship to freedmen, formerly enslaved African Americans. 3. Required the tribes to provide land and rights to the freedmen. This was a major moment in history because it legally tied African Americans to Native American tribes, but not in the way that many people today assume. Did this make African Americans Native? No. The freedmen became citizens of Native American tribes, but they were not originally Native Americans. They were African American people who had been enslaved and later absorbed into tribal nations because of the 1866 treaties. Over time, their descendants became part of the communities, which led to the modern day misconception that African Americans were always indigenous people. Were black people in America before the transatlantic slave trade? Now that we have explored the role of the Five Civilized Tribes and how African Americans became tribal citizens after the Civil War, let's go back even further and examine a key question. Were black people already in America before the slave trade? If we are talking about Africans or people of African descent arriving before Columbus, there is no widely accepted historical or archaeological evidence supporting large-scale African migration to the Americas before European contact. However, we must acknowledge who's been responsible for recording and controlling history. The majority of research on this subject has been conducted by Europeans and European Americans, who have historically downplayed, dismissed, or erased the contributions and presence of Africans and African Americans. There has been a long-standing pattern of excluding African history from mainstream narratives, either to protect the idea of European superiority or to diminish the role of African civilizations. Because of this, some people believe that Africans may have arrived in the Americas before Columbus, pointing to theories that West Africans may have sailed across the Atlantic using knowledge of ocean currents. Ancient civilizations like Olmecs in Mesoamerica may have had African influences. Early European and Arab writings suggest pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas. However, mainstream historians argue that there is no conclusive proof that Africans established settlements in the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade. That doesn't mean that the possibility should be ignored. It simply means that we must examine who wrote the history and why certain narratives are prioritized over others. Those who have the gold make the rules. There's an old saying, those who have the gold make the rules. This means that those in power, those who control wealth, education, and historical records, decide which stories get told and which ones get erased. European nations built their dominance through colonization and transatlantic slave trade, and as a result, much of the historical record favors European perspectives over African ones. So while the current historical records do not confirm a large African presence in the Americas before Columbus, that does not mean the possibility should be dismissed. It simply means we must continue questioning who controls history and what has been left out. Now that we have examined whether Africans arrived in the Americas before Columbus, let's address another key question. Were black people already here as indigenous Americans? If we're talking about black indigenous Americans, meaning dark-skinned people who were native to the land, then yes, such people did exist, but it's important to make a clear distinction. These black indigenous Americans were indigenous, but they were not Indian. They were not connected to the Five Civilized Tribes or other Native American groups that later enslaved African Americans. Some indigenous groups in the Americas, particularly in South America and the Caribbean, had darker skin. Examples include the Caribs and the Arawaks of the Caribbean, the Olmecs of Mesoamerica, often misidentified as African, some southeastern tribes, such as the Yamasee and certain groups in Florida. These people were indigenous to the Americas, but they were not of African descent. Their ancestors migrated from Asia thousands of years ago and developed their own distinct cultures separate from Africans. The source of confusion. So when people say there were black people in America before slavery, we have to ask, do you mean Africans? No. There is no strong evidence of large African settlements before European contact. Do you mean black indigenous Americans? Yes, but they were not African, and they were not the same as Native American tribes that later enslaved black people. The real source of confusion comes from the fact that after the Civil War, many formerly enslaved African Americans became citizens of native tribes. Over time, some families blended into these tribes, and their descendants mistakenly assumed that their ancestors had always been native. But in reality, these African Americans were not originally indigenous. They were people of African ancestry who had been enslaved, freed, and later granted tribal citizenship through the 1866 treaties. Closing thought. History is often written by those in power, but it is up to us to uncover the truth. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep exploring history with us. And as always, this is As Blackwoods, and I am your host, T-Can Hustle, signing off.